One afternoon in September of 1951, a 53-year-old father named Adolphus Eller carried a large cardboard box from his car toward a boarding house in the city of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He took the box inside and then went down a hallway and then into the room where his 21-year-old daughters, whose names were Bobby and Betty, were busy unpacking. Now, for Bobby and Betty, they were both really excited about moving into this boarding house. They had recently decided to, at the same time, move out of the home they'd grown up in, which was in a town about an hour away, which is where their dad, Adolphus, and his wife were currently living. They had decided to move here and get a job at a cigarette factory. They were both gonna work there and live in this boarding house, and it was like a big deal for them. They were, becoming adults. And so for them, they were really excited, but, for their dad, Adolphus, it was bittersweet. On the one hand, he was incredibly proud of them for becoming adults, so to speak. But on the other, it was, sad to see his little girls becoming adults. And so even though they were now, off on their own, they were still together, literally living in this boarding house together and working at the same factory. And so he knew that even though he couldn't be there and neither could their mom, to make sure they were okay, they would have each other, they'd look after each other. And so in a way, he knew they'd be okay. So Bobby and Betty, they were not just, close siblings. They were actually identical twins. They had a really, really deep bond that likely only comes with being a twin. And even amongst, identical twins who are very close with their sibling, it seemed like Bobby and Betty had like a really intense relationship that really went way past whatever was normal amongst identical twins. They really leaned into being identical twins. So they both were 5'3". They both had sort of round faces and dark hair, and they made sure they always styled their hair exactly the same way. But then just beyond their physical appearances being obviously very similar and, styling themselves to look very similar, they also had very, very similar personalities and interests, almost to the point where it was forced. They were both very social, very outgoing, and they both played the piano, and they sang in the glee club at school, and they both made good grades. But also, they seemed to share things that didn't seem possible really to share. For example, they had a tendency to get sick at the same time, but with illnesses that were not necessarily contagious. Like one time, Bobby had developed an abscess on one of her teeth, and she was really sick from it. And kind of inexplicably, Betty got an abscess in her tooth. Like, this is not something she could feign. It was like she just developed the exact same thing at the same time as her twin sister. And then any time, although it was pretty rare, that the sisters were different in some capacity, often because it was forced on them in some way, the sisters would very intentionally sort of do things to recorrect and become similar again. For example, when Bobby had to get glasses because she had bad eyesight, Betty begged to get glasses herself, despite the fact her vision was much better than Bobby's, but she still got those glasses so they could be the same. And now, their big move out of the house involved getting the exact same job at the same factory and living in the same room in the boarding house. And so it really was just a continuation of the same behavior they had always exhibited. Now, there was a part of Adolphus and also his wife that, secretly hoped that Bobby and Betty might eventually become more independent of each other. Like, that seemed like the healthy route for them to eventually take. But as he set down the last box of their things on the floor and looked at his daughters, who had the same identical excited smiles on, he actually found himself feeling grateful that they were kind of taking this leap in tandem like they always would. He just felt like, I just feel like this is a good intermediary step. Let them be dependent on each other for now. It's a good bridge into adulthood. So eventually, after a few minutes, Adolphus said, okay, I'm gonna take off now. Best of luck, I love you. Be in touch whenever you need to. And then he left and he headed back home. 2 years later, Adolphus set the dining room table while his wife finished cooking in the kitchen inside of their home in the small town of Purlear, North Carolina. And Adolphus had just put down the last dinner plate when he heard a knock at the front door. And right away, he felt so excited because he knew that, it's the weekend and my daughters always come to visit me every weekend. That's them. Bobby and Betty are here. They're here for dinner. They're gonna stay for the weekend. And Adolphus and his wife, they really cherished their time with their daughters ever since they had left to go to the factory. So Adolphus, very excitedly, heads to the door and he opens it up and he's really surprised at what he sees. It was Bobby, but Betty wasn't there. And when he said, where's Betty? Is she in the car? Bobby said no. And then also Adolphus took stock of the fact that Bobby had some luggage with her, and she looked really sad, like depressed almost. And he said, Bobby, what's going on? And she said, I hated my job at the factory. I hated it. So I just quit, and I'm coming home. And Betty, she doesn't hate her job. She's gonna stay. She's gonna keep working at the factory and continue to live out there. And for Adolphus, this really is like a huge shift in their behavior. This is not something that these twins ever really did. They did basically everything together. Even if one didn't necessarily want to do the thing the other was interested in, they would often just do the same things, again, to sort of mimic each other and be similar and just do everything the same. And so the idea that they're doing such drastically different things, one coming home and leaving the job, the other continuing to live out on her own, was just a huge departure. And then on top of that, Adolphus said to Bobby, he's like, okay, well, of course you can stay here. Of course you can come home, but where's Betty? Is she gonna be here for the weekend? Is she gonna come home and visit with you? She can keep working there, but is she visiting this weekend? And Bobby was like, no, she's gonna stay. She's actually not coming home this weekend. She's decided to stay. And so again, it just felt like, what's going on here for Adolphus and his wife? This is a crazy big shift. But, very quickly Adolphus said, look, just come on in, have dinner, get situated, we'll talk about this, we'll figure out, what your next steps need to be, but of course you can stay here and everything will be fine. And so Bobby, she picked her stuff up, she came inside, but then she quickly said she was not hungry and did not want to eat with them. And then she just went up to her bedroom, brought her stuff inside the room, shut the door, and didn't come out again. And over the next 2 years, Bobby continued to basically just stay in her bedroom. She rarely left her room. She just closed herself in there and shut down almost entirely. She never talked to her parents about really why she left the factory or what she hated so much about the job that forced her to quit. She didn't talk about anything. She didn't reconnect with old friends or seek out new ones. In fact, she became incredibly introverted. Whereas before, when she and her sister were both living under this roof, they both were very extroverted. They were always out doing social things. And now, Bobby is like a recluse in the room. She also was not showing any sign of making moves to change her current situation. She wasn't seeking a job. She wasn't looking for new opportunities. It was like she sort of had just declined to the point where she just was going to stay in her bedroom in perpetuity. But over the course of those 2 years that Bobby was home, there were several moments where she would sort of snap back and be herself again, the sort of extroverted, happy, social, normal version of Bobby that her parents were used to. And that was when Betty would come home from the factory to visit on the weekends. It was like when Betty walked in the door, Bobby became reanimated and became her old self, and the two just immediately fell into rhythm as if no time had passed, like there's no ill will towards each other about the fact that they're not working at the factory or living together anymore. It was like everything went back to normal, and then Betty would leave to go back to the factory, and Bobby would go back to her room and shut the door. And so for Adolphus and his wife, part of them had always hoped that these two, would eventually separate and kind of learn to live independently. But even though Betty, who was staying out at the factory and living on her own, appeared basically to be doing okay on her own, it just seems sort of obvious that Bobby was just completely falling apart without her sister. She was utterly dependent on her. It was so clear. And so Adolphus really didn't know, how this was going to play out. It just sort of seemed like over time, this was definitely getting worse, certainly for Bobby. But around the time that Adolphus and his wife are sort of trying to figure this out, what to do about Bobby, 2 years in to her being home, right around that same time frame, so 2 years in, Betty sort of inexplicably came home one Friday and said, you know what, I quit the factory too, and I'm going to live here as well. And in a weird way, Adolphus and his wife were relieved because it meant that realistically, the daughters would almost certainly fall back in step with each other and return to their normal selves. And really, for Bobby's sake, it seemed like this would be an enormous, plus in her life. She really was falling apart here, and they had seen how happy she was every time Betty came home to visit over those 2 years. And so there was a relief that Betty was home. But there was also it didn't really make sense that Betty was quitting her job. Really, it seemed like she liked her job. She seemed to be doing well on her own. Adolphus couldn't necessarily prove this, but he believed that ultimately what Betty must be doing here is what she and her sister always did, which is we will do the same things even if we don't necessarily want to. Like Betty basically was sacrificing her independent life to come back home and be with her sister and sort of fall into step like they always did. That's what it seemed like. But again, it seemed like the silver lining was, at least our daughters will be normal again. They'll be happy and healthy again. But that is not what happened. Once Betty came back home, she quit the factory and she and Bobby are now living once again under the same roof. They absolutely did fall back in step with each other like they always had done. But their connection to each other, their dependence, their attachment on each other was so extreme, way more than before. And before, it was already extreme. So this is like way beyond what's reasonable. They basically went into the bedroom where they both were living, which was Bobby's bedroom. Now Betty was living in there as well. They went into that bedroom and just shut the door and just stayed in there together, basically 24/7. So they did not, become the extroverted girls that they used to be. They became introverted, but together. They didn't seek out jobs. They certainly didn't show any interest in getting jobs. They, again, were not socializing. They just stayed in that room basically 24/7. They slept in the same bed. And then in the rare times that they would leave the bedroom, they would walk side by side, like they were touching shoulders, like everywhere they went. They had to basically be on top of each other. And they also moved almost like in sync, like robots. They were just doing the exact same thing. And then anywhere they went, they could not separate. Like any room they went to in the house, they were together. Go to the bathroom, they're going together. I mean, everything was together. It was a level of attachment that the parents had never seen before. Now, of course, Adolphus and his wife were concerned about this. They didn't really know even what to call what they were seeing. It just seemed like codependency to a fault. But they were sort of hoping that, eventually the girls would kind of level out again and they'd get their lives back on track, even if they retained that really intense bond. But then it got worse. In addition to basically shutting themselves in this room all the time and, never being apart from each other, they also stopped eating. At first, it just seemed like they were, just not interested in dinner. Adolphus would go up to the bedroom and he'd knock on the door and it would open a crack and both Bobby and Betty's faces would come to the door at the same time. And Adolphus would say, hey, dinner's on the table. Do you want to come down to eat? And the girls, without even looking at each other, would say in perfect unison, we're not hungry. And then they would shut the door. And it was like, okay, I guess they just don't want to eat. But then weeks would go by and the girls would just refuse to come out and eat. And so the girls began to lose a considerable amount of weight, like an unhealthy amount of weight. But no matter what Adolphus and his wife did, they just would not eat. And so after a couple of weeks of this, Adolphus and his wife decided that, they clearly were not going to get through to their daughters and get them to change their behavior just by presenting them with logic. Hey, you really ought to come down here and eat because you have to eat to survive. Like, they're not listening to that. There's something going on here. And it seemed increasingly obvious that it was mental, that these girls were really struggling with some sort of mental illness. At least that was the parents' suggestion. And so they brought their daughters to go see a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist very quickly actually made a diagnosis. They said that Bobby and Betty both had schizophrenia, which is a very serious chronic brain condition that affects the way you think, the way you behave. Basically all the ways in which you interact with the world can be gravely affected by schizophrenia. And so a lot of their strange behaviors or their anomalous behaviors, in particular, their not eating and their codependency, the psychiatrist believed could basically be explained by schizophrenia. And so ultimately, the psychiatrist prescribed Bobby and Betty some antipsychotic medication and promised Adolphus that if they take these meds, they'd be okay. But even though Adolphus and his wife ensured that Bobby and Betty took their medication exactly as they were supposed to every single day, the twins did not seem to get any better. If anything, they actually continued to get worse. They spent, if anything, more time, locked in their bedroom, and they became more frail, and they continued to barely eat, and they also began showing signs of being very paranoid around anybody that was not their other sibling, even their own parents. It was like the only person either Bobby and Betty could be around was the other. They couldn't be around anybody else. They just kind of hid themselves away, basically 24/7. And so pretty quickly, Adolphus came to the realization that these antipsychotic meds are not doing enough, or maybe they're not doing anything at all. But at the same time, Adolphus did not think that, the diagnosis was wrong. He believed his daughters did have schizophrenia. The symptoms basically fit, but the treatment wasn't working. And so in Adolphus's mind, he felt like what he needed to do was just get his girls more and better psychiatric help. So in early 1961, when Bobby and Betty were both now 30 years old, Adolphus had them both involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. And at first, it seemed like this hospital stay was exactly what the girls needed. Because, they gained weight back pretty quickly because they were being forced to eat, and they were also being monitored effectively 24/7, and they were given proper medication, and, they were just kind of comprehensively looked after, and so pretty quickly they got better. And also the girls were allowed to stay in the same room together. They really never separated them, which was an important part of their recovery as they had each other. And so after several weeks in the hospital, they were deemed, healthy and back to normal, so to speak, and they were discharged. But pretty much immediately, once they got back to their family home, they regressed right back to being, secluded in the bedroom, not eating, and being completely introverted and completely not normal, not healthy. And so, again, they were committed. And again, they got better while they were at the hospital, but then once they were discharged and back home, they got worse again, over and over and over again for over a year. It was like they were in and out of the hospital. It just didn't seem like they were making any real progress. And so eventually, Adolphus and his wife and several doctors and nurses that had treated the two girls over the past year during their numerous hospital stays, eventually they all kind of came to the conclusion that it could be possible that what was happening here is these girls had schizophrenia, and that was kind of the root cause of all their issues. Or maybe it was just their intense dependency on each other that was effectively causing all their problems. That what could have been viewed as like this timeless bond between siblings was actually like a really deeply unhealthy codependency where they were so enmeshed in the other that like they couldn't grow as people and become independently functioning adults, that they were kind of stuck, and that unless drastic action was taken, they would continue to be stuck and continue to decline, or at least spiral the way they had been. And so a decision was made to, without asking the girls, to forcibly separate them and see if that made a big difference. And so on April 11th, 1962, Bobby and Betty were both once again committed to the hospital. Except this time, for the first time, they were separated. They were put in literal opposite ends of the hospital in totally separate wards, and they completely lost their minds. The girls begged and screamed and demanded to be kept together. But the staff said, nope, it's for your own good. A few hours after the girls had been separated at the hospital, so this is the first time they're being kept apart. This is like 1 a.m. on the morning of April 12th. Adolphus was at home asleep when his phone rang. And he was confused because it's the middle of the night, like who's calling him? But when he picked up the phone, he heard a hospital doctor's voice on the other end, and the doctor sounded completely frantic. And he tried to explain to Adolphus what was going on. Adolphus was aware of the fact that the girls were going to be separated, but everything the doctor was saying about what had followed after the separation just didn't make any sense. And he was trying to clarify, like, what are you talking about? But the doctor finally just paused and then just clearly stated basically the disaster that had unfolded after the separation, that something they could have never planned for has happened, and even the doctor didn't really know what to make of it. And when Adolphus heard this, he just sat there on the phone, completely frozen, having no idea how to react. Over the next few days, doctors at that psychiatric hospital tried to come up with a rational, scientific explanation for what happened on the night that Bobby and Betty were separated. But they couldn't figure it out. So, in an effort to figure it out, they called in the North Carolina State Board of Investigators for some help. But they couldn't figure it out. And so they called in the FBI. And the FBI couldn't figure it out either. Nobody had any idea how this could have happened or why. And so as this story naturally began to leak out to the press and began circulating in newspapers all over the country as like this unbelievable mystery, a lot of people, as they saw the story, began to wonder if maybe the explanation for what happened after these girls were separated is not rooted in science. Maybe what happened is something that we as humans, we can't really understand, but it doesn't make it any less real. It would turn out at 12:55 a.m. on the night or early morning that Bobby and Betty were separated in the hospital. A nurse in the ward where Bobby had been moved to was doing her regular rounds. And when she got to Bobby's room, she found Bobby lying in her bed on her side, and she was dead. About 5 minutes later, at 1 a.m., a doctor went to check on Betty in the ward where she was on the other end of the hospital, and this doctor found Betty was also dead in her bed, lying in the exact same position that Bobby was. But the strange thing is there was no obvious sign of what killed them. There was no sign of illness. There was no sign of self-harm. There was no sign of violence or foul play. It was like, inexplicably, both of these girls were just dead. And then even after doing multiple autopsies, nobody could figure it out. Like, there wasn't a reason that they died. Forget foul play, forget how it happened. There wasn't a medical diagnosis for what killed them. They just suddenly died. And so the only real conclusion they had was that somehow the twins had died from no apparent cause at almost the exact same time. The twins' cause of death was officially listed as ill-defined and unknown. The only theory that anyone has been able to come up with about what happened came from one of the doctors who treated Bobby and Betty in the hospital. He believed that the twins were so distressed about being forcibly separated that they found a way to reunite by, quote, willing themselves to die. Basically, the twins' need, the spiritual, physical, emotional need to be with the other and having that taken from them was so strong, so powerful, that they basically forced themselves to shut down and die in hopes that their spirits could reconnect. But as crazy as that sounds, there's actually one more very strange detail about the way they died that seems to add a layer of credibility to the idea that whatever happened here is bigger than science. It's something paranormal, it's something supernatural, it's something else. And that was that when they found Bobby and Betty's bodies, just 5 minutes apart from each other on opposite ends of the hospital, they weren't just laying in bed in the same position as the other. No, it seemed like they were positioned sort of awkwardly on their bed. If you think about how a bed works, it's a rectangle and you lay vertically along the bed. The girls were found sort of a little bit at an angle on their respective beds, like they were sort of positioned in a non-natural, non-parallel way with their bed. They were sort of almost perpendicular to the flow of their bed. And at first it was just an anomaly about how they were found. Oh, they died and they sort of got into this position. But then somebody realized if you removed all the walls, just in your mind, if you removed all the walls between each of the rooms they were in, the way they were laying on the bed made sense because the girls, in their own way, positioned themselves to be looking exactly at each other when they died.
Mount Fuji is the highest mountain in Japan, rising up to 3,776 meters, and it's actually a volcano. It's dormant. The last time it erupted was in 1707, but geologists still classify it as active. Tourists are allowed to climb Mount Fuji, but only between July and September, because in the winter months, the mountain gets completely treacherous. There's snow and ice, and the wind picks up. It's very, very dangerous, so it's off limits. Now, thrill seekers, if they really wanted to, they could climb Mount Fuji in the winter, because there isn't a security guard posted up at the bottom of Mount Fuji checking people in and out. It's on you. If you want to climb it when it's off limits, well, then you're climbing at your own risk, because basically it's a terrible idea. But if you have the right equipment and you have all the right training, it is doable. One thrill seeker, a 47-year-old named Tetsu, decided he wanted to hike Mount Fuji in the winter of 2019. He wanted to live stream his entire journey to the summit. Now, Tetsu might have been a thrill seeker, but he certainly wasn't a mountain climber. He did not have the experience, nor did he have any of the equipment necessary for a climb up Mount Fuji in the winter. Wearing only street clothes and carrying nothing more than climbing poles and his smartphone, he turned on his live stream and he began hiking up the Shubashiri Trail. Viewers began tuning in as Tetsu happily made his way up this ash-covered trail, and then the ash turned into light snow, and then light snow turned into really heavy snow and ice and wind, and then Tetsu began complaining about how cold he was and how he couldn't feel his hands, and his viewers are egging him on to, keep going, keep pushing through it, and probably because of the pressure he felt from his viewers, he kept going when really this would have been the moment to turn around. When you're realizing that you don't have the right equipment and it's getting really cold and you're probably not even halfway up, that's the time to turn around, but he didn't. He pressed on. As he moved up the mountain, the path he was on continued to narrow and become increasingly more covered in ice, and the guard fence that straddled the side of this path was getting to the place where it comes to a stop, signaling the most dangerous section of the hike, which is the last leg up to the summit. He gets to that point where the fence comes to an end, and now he's on this narrow stretch where the wind is just whipping across and it's all ice, and he's trying to walk across the ice with this totally inappropriate footwear. He should have had on at least crampons, the metal spikes that go on the bottom of your shoe to grip ice. He just had tennis shoes on, and so he's slipping and sliding as he's walking up this icy trail, and then he finally staggers and falls, but he catches himself. And you can hear him laughing on the live stream, joking with his audience how dangerous and slippery it is, and his viewers begin to change their tone a little bit, and they're like, hey, you might want to consider turning around now, but Tetsu is totally focused on getting to the top. So he stands back up and he continues to kind of shuffle his way towards the summit on this stretch of ice. He finally gets right up below the summit to where on his live stream you can actually see the top of Mount Fuji. And you can tell that his footwear at this point is basically not able to handle how slick it is. He's basically constantly stumbling. And you can see he notices a little stretch of small rocks that seem to almost make stepping stones up to the summit. And he begins walking over very carefully on the ice to try to use these rocks to get himself up to the top. And right as he's trying to step for one of these rocks, he loses his balance, and on camera he says, wait, I'm slipping! And then he falls and begins rocketing down the side of this mountain. Now, when you fall on a steep mountain, you have one, maybe two chances to self-arrest. So, for example, if you had an ice pick and you were like Tetsu and you start falling, you would want to roll over and dig the head of that ice pick into the ground and basically anchor your knees and elbows and drive everything you can into the snow to stop yourself from falling. And so if you can't do that in one or two attempts, your momentum will pick up and you'll be going too fast and you won't be able to stop yourself. And then you just gotta hope you survive the fall. Tetsu did not have an ice pick or any other tool to help him self-arrest, and he didn't have the training for what to do in a situation like this, so he didn't even attempt to roll over and dig his elbows or knees into the ground to try to slow down. So he just goes flying down the mountain, he's on his back, he's not slowing down, and he knows he's doomed. And he says on camera, well, it can't be helped, before he flies over the edge and falls hundreds of meters down to his death. His viewers who watched this happen alerted authorities, who found his body the next day over 1,000 meters away from where he had first fallen. Unfortunately, every year there is a handful of people that attempt to climb Mount Fuji in the winter, and they meet the same fate. In 1962, Chileno Sanchez was born into a poor family in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. When he was just 15 years old, one of his sisters was assaulted by a very rich and powerful man in their town, and so he never got punished for it. 2 years later, when Chileno was 17, he saw this man at a party, and he walked up to him and shot him in the head, killing him instantly. After the murder, Chileno fled to Tijuana before ultimately crossing the US border into Los Angeles, where he stayed with his aunt. He worked odd jobs like picking vegetables and selling cars before he ultimately went into business with his brother, who was back in Mexico, and he worked with him to smuggle Mexicans into the US. But that operation stopped in 1984 when his brother was murdered in Tijuana. To commemorate his brother, Chileno, who always loved music, wrote a song about him, and he formatted the song in the typical Mexican ballad style called corrido, but his lyrics were graphic and gritty, something nobody else did when they wrote a corrido. Chileno spoke honestly and openly not only about how his brother was killed, but also the struggles of living around drug trafficking and violence in Mexico. Shortly after writing the song, Chileno wound up in jail in Tijuana, Mexico, and while he was there, he would sing the song he wrote about his brother, singer, and other inmates heard it and loved it. They had never heard a corrido sung like that. And so they asked Cellino if he would write songs about them and their exploits. Soon, Cellino was being commissioned by all these inmates in this prison to write their songs in exchange for money and for favors. When Cellino got out of prison, his unique songwriting abilities had spread beyond the prison walls to other criminals and drug traffickers and kingpins in Mexico, and before long, Cellino was being approached by those people to write their songs. His corridos pioneered a new subgenre of music called narco corrido for their ties to the narcotics industry. Some people today compare the style and lyrics of the narco corrido to gangster rap. By 1987, Cellino's music was not just being shared amongst his paying clients. It had spread into Los Angeles and all over Mexico and was becoming very popular, even though it wasn't being played on the radio because radios thought his lyrics were too graphic. And so it was spreading largely because of word of mouth and because Cellino himself would go to car washes and street corners and he would sell his cassettes to anybody who would take them. By 1991, Cellino was so famous that he actually went on tour, and everywhere he went, the venue would be completely sold out. But given what his narco corridos were about, largely about drug trafficking and the people that are involved in that ecosystem, the people that would actually come to his performances were often rough and dangerous people, or were at least tied to rough and dangerous people. In 1992, when Cellino was performing in California, while he was on stage, this 33-year-old guy rushed onto stage with him and drew a gun on him, and Cellino, who was always carrying a weapon himself, drew his pistol and fired at this guy first, and then what ensued was this crazy gunfight on stage, practically point blank, between Cellino and this guy, and they both managed to shoot each other. Cellino got shot in the lung, and this guy got shot in the mouth. They would both survive, but 8 audience members also got shot, and one of them actually died. This made international headlines and, by all accounts, should have devastated Cellino's career. But in fact, it had the opposite effect. It made him 10 times more famous because Cellino, he was representing narco corrido music. And so in being the face of that, he kind of represented drug trafficking and criminals and outlaws all over Mexico and in the United States. And so he was kind of representing a very tough group of people. And so for him to have stood his ground on stage and shot first at this guy coming to attack him, it made him look brave. It made him look like a warrior. It validated him as the right person to be the face of narco corridos. But Cellino also understood that this probably was not the last time that someone was going to try to hurt him. That in virtue of being the face of narco culture, there's bound to be people that are very violent that don't like him, and they might come after him too. And so he actually told his inner circle that he thought his days were numbered, that at some point someone was going to kill him. 4 months after the shootout, Cellino was back home in Sinaloa, Mexico, performing at a concert that his friends had told him he shouldn't do because he had lots of enemies in his hometown. But Cellino really wanted to do it. He got into the venue, he got on stage, his band was getting ready, thousands of people were coming into the audience, and before the show started, somebody handed him a note. And so Cellino takes the note, he's smiling, he's kind of looking around at the crowd, and then he looks down at the note and he reads it, and right away his expression completely changes. He looks distressed, he rubs his brow, he frowns, he kind of looks up at the crowd like he's looking for someone, and then he just goes blank in the face, and he's looking out like he's looking past the crowd. And it's this long period of time where he's just blank staring into the audience. And then all of a sudden he just snaps out of it, takes the note, puts it in his pocket, picks up the microphone, and proceeds to give one of his best live performances to date. After the concert was over, Cellino made a special effort to say bye to everybody in his band, and he said bye to some people in the crowd, and then finally, after this kind of long drawn out goodbye, he walked out the back door. Shortly after, he was kidnapped, tied up, and then shot in the back of the head, execution style. It would turn out that note he received on stage was from his killers, who we don't know exactly who they are still to this day, but the note said, after this performance, we're going to kill you. And so that was the reason Cellino was so distressed, because whoever it was, he obviously understood it was a credible threat. But instead of panicking, he just decided he would give an amazing performance and then face his destiny. And so when he went outside, he knew he was going to get murdered, and he did. On September 25th, 1978, a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727 jet airliner entered San Diego airspace. Like all PSA aircraft, Flight 182 had a whimsical black button nose and smiley face painted underneath the cockpit. These so-called grinning birds were synonymous with the company's self-promoting ad campaign about them being the world's friendliest airline. But the airline was often criticized for being too friendly with their super low airfares, their kind of comic banter that the captains would employ through the intercom to passengers, and their female flight attendants who wore miniskirts and were instructed to make nice with the male passengers. Because the weather was clear, air traffic control directed Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox to switch from instrument flight rules to visual flight rules procedures and to begin their final descent. Visual flight rules refers to pilots using their eyes to guide the plane. It's done when they're flying low, the weather's clear, and they can see the ground. At 8:59 a.m. that morning, as PSA Flight 182 descended down to 4,000 feet, air traffic control advised them of a Cessna, which is a small plane, that was ascending in their direction. Fox responded that they saw the Cessna, and so air traffic control came back and said to maintain visual separation. Maintain visual separation meant that despite ground radar-based controllers who could provide vertical and lateral separation criteria, the burden for maintaining separation fell solely on Captain McFerrin and his crew. In layman's terms, air traffic control was telling them, don't lose sight of the Cessna. Inside the Cessna was a flight instructor named Martin Casey and his student, who was a United States Marine named David Boswell. As this little plane ascended, air traffic control informed them that PSA 182, who was right in front of them and slightly above them, they were on their descent. However, they had the Cessna in sight. As a result, the men inside of the Cessna did not take it upon themselves to actively begin looking for this jet. They assumed the pilots of PSA 182, who had them in sight, would avoid them. Back in PSA 182, there seemed to be some confusion in the cockpit. The two pilots were debating whether the Cessna they were watching fly lower than them, past them on the right, was the same Cessna that air traffic control had told them about. And at some point they agreed, yep, that's got to be the same Cessna. And so they called in to air traffic control that it looks like the Cessna has passed us. They've flown past us on the right. Immediately after this transmission, the black box recorded the two pilots talking to each other, basically trying to convince the other that yes, that was definitely the right Cessna. But after a couple of minutes of reassuring themselves, one of them says, boy, I hope that was the right Cessna. According to later testimony by the air traffic controller who was in communication with the pilots of PSA 182 as they were on their final descent, he would say when Captain McFerrin came over and said the Cessna has passed him on the right, he believed him and he didn't think to check to make sure it was the right one. But in reality, the Cessna that McFerrin and Fox had seen was the wrong one. The real Cessna they were supposed to maintain visual separation with, the one containing Casey and Boswell, was still ascending in the direct flight path of PSA 182, except now this Cessna is in 182's blind spot below their nose, so they literally can't see each other. At 9:01 that morning, air traffic control got an alarm that PSA 182 and this Cessna are about to collide, but for some reason the air traffic controller did not alert both aircraft. Instead, this controller only contacted the Cessna and didn't tell them this was a dire situation. They said, hey, there's traffic in your vicinity, but I'm pretty sure it's just PSA 182 and they already see you, so you're fine. So Casey and Boswell inside of the Cessna just continued to ascend. 1 minute later at 9:02 a.m., PSA 182 flies directly over the Cessna and strikes them with their nose wheel. The Cessna gets hooked by the wheel and flips upside down and gets trapped underneath the right wing of the jet. Seconds later, the Cessna splits in two. The tail section containing David Boswell plummets to the earth like a rag doll. The nose section of the Cessna that contained Martin Casey stayed trapped underneath the right wing for a few seconds before it detonated. Inside of PSA 182, this explosion was deafening, and immediately after it, McFerrin was recorded saying, easy baby, easy baby. Then he asks Fox, what's the damage? And Fox says, it's bad, man, we're hit. Despite trying to keep the plane flying level, it lurched forward into an unrecoverable nosedive, and McFerrin, knowing they were doomed, calmly calls out to air traffic control and says, we're going down. Air traffic responded, okay, we'll have the equipment ready for you. Then the black box recorded the sound of a stall warning inside the cockpit, and as the aircraft streaked at over 300 miles per hour straight towards the ground, McFerrin's last known transmission to air traffic was, this is it, baby. Seconds before impact, McFerrin gave his final command over the intercom, which was, brace yourselves, and then right before the black box cut out, someone in the cabin yelled, I love you, Mom. At 9:03 a.m., PSA 182 slammed nose first into the ground just outside of downtown San Diego in an area called North Park. The resulting explosion of thousands of gallons of jet fuel sent a shockwave that was registered 2 miles away. Almost immediately, firefighters were rushing towards the rising mushroom cloud of black, oily smoke, and many of the first responders that arrived at the crash site in those first few hours were deeply disturbed at what they saw. The bodies that had not been destroyed in the explosion had gotten trapped up in the trees. All told, 144 people were killed in this accident. 135 were from PSA 182, 2 were from the Cessna, and 7 were just unlucky people that were standing on the ground in North Park. Following a 1-year investigation into the mid-air collision, it was determined that the flight crew of PSA 182 was found to be primarily responsible because there was that moment that was picked up in the black box where the 2 pilots were unsure if the Cessna that passed them was the right one, but instead of calling that into air traffic control and getting confirmation, they blew it off. The morning of the crash, a San Diego photographer was at a press event when he heard the explosion overhead, which was 182 colliding with the Cessna, and he began taking pictures, and he captured these now 2 infamous photos of PSA 182 seconds before they hit the ground.
Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places, like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so this rope has been very carefully measured so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who were already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait. And over the next several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yesenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time. And this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do. And so she was beginning to second guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself. But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yesenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. And so several hours went by of this totally high stress,
anxious waiting period, and then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform, so they're looking out over this ravine, and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision, her heart is racing, she's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, "Okay, jump." And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, "Okay, jump," was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge, he leapt over the railing, and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. In 1998, Fresha Bakery, which was a bread company in Leicester, England, was all about profits. And their employees knew this, because all the time, corners were being cut for the sake of money, even if it was totally dangerous. In May of that year, one of the company's industrial ovens needed a minor repair. One of the cogs inside the oven had come loose and fallen off, and someone just needed to pick it up and put it back on. To picture this oven in your head, think of the scanner you put your luggage through at the airport, the X-ray machine. It's kind of like that. It was this 80-foot long metal tunnel where there was a conveyor belt that ran through it, and you would put dough on one side and it would run through with the conveyor belt through this oven, and then on the other side it would be fully cooked. Whenever repairs were needed inside one of these ovens, the procedure was to completely turn off the oven. So not just the heat, but the whole operation needed to be completely shut down, and then the oven would sit for almost a full 24 hours before a mechanic would go in and make the repair. But the mechanic cost money, and every hour that this bread machine was not operational, the company would lose $1,500. And so the managers of this company thought, you know what, that's too much money to be giving up. If we do the repairs ourselves, that saves us on the cost of the mechanic, and if we can find a way to make the repairs while leaving the oven partially running, that will save us a whole bunch of money too. Someone pointed out that it was possible to turn the heat all the way down in the oven, but allow the conveyor belt to keep rotating through. They just needed to find a way to get in with this conveyor belt moving around them. And so they came up with a plan. Even though the oven sat flush to the ground, there was a side panel that could open up and you could crawl underneath the oven, and right above you would be the conveyor belt. And so they thought, well, hey, if we just remove a couple of sections of the conveyor belt, when that gap in the belt cycles around and is right over someone who is standing underneath it, they can stand up into that gap and kind of be hunched over and walk along inside of the oven, staying in that gap until they come across the cog that's going to be right on the ground. They can pick it up, put it right back on, and keep walking on, staying in the gap until they reach the other side, at which point they could crawl out the exit. The managers were confident, and so they began walking around the factory asking for volunteers, and they were offering extra pay. Two men, 44-year-old Ian Erickson and 47-year-old David Mays, volunteered for the job, and their managers told them they would do it the next day because they needed time to turn the heat off on the oven and let it cool down first. That night, David was out with his friends, and he was talking about how he was kind of nervous about getting inside of a semi-operational industrial oven, but he told them the money was good. The following day at 9 a.m., the oven's heat was turned all the way down, and the plan was it would sit like that all day and cool off all day, and then in the evening, Ian and David would get inside and do the job. But Ian and David had a really important soccer game they wanted to watch that night, and so they asked their manager, would it be possible to go in a little bit earlier? And so the manager walked down to the oven and put his hand inside one of the entrances, and there were fans blowing into it, and it had been off for a couple of hours, and he thought, you know what, this is probably fine, you guys can go now. A few sections of the conveyor belt were removed, Ian was given a radio, and the two men opened the side to the oven and they crawled in on the far left side of the oven and they waited for the gap to come around. When it did, they popped up and they began their journey into the center of the oven. About 5 minutes later, Ian came over the radio and said, "Hey, it's really hot in here." And the manager came back and said, "Don't worry, it's supposed to be a little warm in there, but it's nothing that can hurt you." And then a couple of seconds later, Ian comes back over the radio and says, "No, it's really hot in here. It is unbearably hot in here." And so one of the managers ran over and checked the temperature gauge, which unbelievably no one had done to that point. And the temperature at the center of the oven was reading over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. It was hot enough to boil water in the center of this oven. And unfortunately, there was nowhere for Ian or David to go. The belt could not go in reverse, and the fastest it could move is 17 minutes start to finish, so agonizingly slow. And they could not crawl up or below the conveyor belt in either direction. There wasn't enough clearance, and they'd get sucked up into the machinery. So they literally had to stay in the gap and slowly walk towards the hottest section of the oven. And so for 10 minutes, Ian and David slowly made their way across this oven, screaming out in pain, yelling for help from anyone, someone, but no one could do anything. And even if they hit the emergency stop button on the oven, it wouldn't help them because the heat inside of the oven is not because it's on, it was residual heat. And by turning off the oven, that would just stop the conveyor belt, trapping Ian and David in the hottest part of the oven. Workers ran and got their tools and did everything they could to try to dismantle portions of the oven to try to get down to Ian and David. But by the time they finally pulled off big pieces of the oven, Ian had already made it to the other side and been pulled out, and he was unfortunately deceased. He had been burned alive, and David had collapsed somewhere in the oven and had been crushed by the machinery that went over him. The bakery and their management team were all fined for their part in this tragedy. When the earth collapses in on itself, creating a hole in the ground that sucks away anything in its wake, that's called a sinkhole. These holes form when water dissolves the rock layer underneath the soil. They range dramatically in size, from a barely noticeable depression in the ground to massive chasms that are hundreds of meters wide and deep. If you're one of the unfortunate few that falls into a large sinkhole, you probably won't get out again, because the ground inside of a sinkhole after the initial implosion just continues to sink. So if you were standing on the ground inside of a sinkhole, you would continuously be pulled into the ground as it continued to crumble and churn like quicksand below your feet. And even if you managed to get to the sides inside of the sinkhole, you could not climb up again because there wouldn't be any handholds because the soil is all loose and wet. Luckily, most sinkholes form slowly and show lots of warning signs, allowing people to get away before it opens up. But there are unique circumstances where large sinkholes can appear out of nowhere. In Russia, hot water is piped into business and residential buildings during the harsh winters. On November 19th, 2019, in the Russian city of Penza, which is 340 miles south of Moscow, a large hot water pipe burst underground below a car park. Initially, nobody knew the pipe had burst, but witnesses would later say they saw steam coming out of the ground near the car park, but they didn't think anything of it. A few minutes after the steam appeared, 49-year-old Vladimir Volyelkin was driving his car through the car park. With him was his co-worker, 53-year-old Igor Chikasov. They worked together at a furniture store. As they made their way towards the exit of this car park, there was another car ahead of them that rolled over that section of pavement that was steaming, and they watched as it rolled over and drove off, and nothing happened. And so Vladimir and Igor, they drove over that section of pavement and the ground collapsed under them. The burst hot water pipe had injected thousands of gallons of water into the soil right under the pavement, and so it caused a sinkhole. But not just any sinkhole, a sinkhole that was slowly filling with boiling water. When the ground collapsed under Igor's car, it flipped the car forward and it landed upside down at the bottom of this 10-meter deep sinkhole. And it landed just perfectly to where the doors could not open. They would hit the sides of the sinkhole, which also meant they couldn't roll the windows down and crawl out because they would hit the sides of the sinkhole. The men managed to get their seatbelts off and flip themselves around and began kicking on the windshield and yelling out for help. At this point, onlookers had made it to the edge of the sinkhole, and when they looked down inside, they realized there was nothing anyone could do. Jumping in was a death sentence. So they watched in horror as Vladimir and Igor desperately tried to escape, but the scalding water continued to fill the hole until it began leaking into the cabin of the vehicle, at which point the men went quiet. A few moments later, the car completely disappeared from view under the boiling water. Although not held criminally responsible, the water company that owned the pipe that burst offered to pay compensation to both families as well as cover all funeral costs. Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming is one of the most remarkable and beautiful places on Earth. Not only is it renowned for its biodiversity, which includes some incredibly resilient microbial organisms, it's also home to one of the world's so-called supervolcanoes. This supervolcano sits atop one of the world's largest magma bodies fueled by an upwelling plume of superheated material. This dynamic and violent subterranean plumbing means the water bodies at the surface, the famous Yellowstone hot springs, are highly acidic and incredibly hot. If you were to ignore the countless warnings around these hot springs telling you to stay away, do not go in the hot springs, if you were to ignore those and go in one, or more accurately, fall in one, this is what would happen to you. First, your body would register that your skin was bathing in waters exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This would hurt like nothing you can possibly imagine. But it would only hurt as long as your nervous system was able to register pain, which would only be for about 1 minute or less. At this temperature, your skin would begin to quickly break down and disintegrate, and your blood vessels in your underlying dermis would rupture, causing rapid blood loss. Some underlying skin layers would not break down, but they would lose all of their water and become tough and blackened. And your underlying subcutaneous fat would bubble off as well. All in all, this is known as a full thickness burn, and it would occur in about 1 minute in these waters. Your nervous system would enter a state of shock and become irreversibly damaged, which would lead to most, if not all, of your organs to fail if the heat stress has not already done that to you. You would be dead within 2 to 3 minutes, and then at that point, the acidity of the water would take over. Within a few hours, your body, including your skeleton, would be completely dissolved into absolute nothingness. And for anyone who falls in but manages to climb out again before being dissolved, they are not out of the woods. Many of those people, unfortunately, will die hours, days, months later due to complications from the burns. On June 7, 2016, Colin Scott and his sister Sable went to Yellowstone to see the famous hot springs. The siblings were exploring the Norris Geyser Basin, which is the park's oldest and hottest thermal area, when they decided to leave the safety of the boardwalk and walk past all the signs telling them, do not leave the boardwalk, this is dangerous, turn around. They decided to walk past all of those and venture out off the course. They walked approximately 200 meters away from the path to the edge of a hot spring that was not really part of the main tour, and they were just standing there when Colin apparently tripped and fell into the hot spring. And his sister was just not able to do anything. She knew she couldn't go in after him, and he very quickly sunk below the surface and didn't come up again. She ran back to try to get help, but by the time they got back to the edge of the hot spring, he was gone. And in fact, the only thing they would find of Colin Scott was his flip-flops. Since 1890, Colin Scott, along with 21 other people, have died by falling into these hot springs. Despite the fact that today there is already tons of shocking content on the internet, there is still something truly insane about Wu Yongning's videos. In 2017, Wu was a 26-year-old climbing enthusiast who was dubbed China's first rooftopper. A rooftopper is someone who, usually illegally, climbs onto rooftops, cranes, smokestacks, big antennas, skyscrapers, or any other really high, dangerous location. Almost always, these daredevils are going to these incredibly dangerous locations in order to capture footage of themselves so they can post it to the internet in hopes that it goes viral and they become famous and make a bunch of money. But because there are so many people competing for the internet's attention, rooftoppers really need to push the envelope if they want to stand out and make it big. And Wu Yongning did just that, and the internet rewarded him with millions of followers and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Most rooftoppers would go to the tops of these incredible incredible locations and then take selfies of themselves standing there posing at the top. Woo would do that, but he also did a couple other things that nobody else was doing that kind of became his trademarks. The first one was he would dangle over the edge of the building or the crane or the antenna that he was holding onto, and he would do pull-ups, but he would keep doing them until he reached muscle failure and then would barely be able to pull himself back up to safety. Another trademark move is he would go to the top of these huge buildings and he would get right on the edge and he would do a handstand and then he would pull one arm back. So he's doing a one-armed handstand and then he would tilt his body as far as he could over the edge until he couldn't do it any farther and he'd let himself come back over to safety. And then perhaps the most difficult to watch trademark was when Woo would basically run up to the edge of buildings and stop just short. And he wouldn't just run to the edge, he would use a self-balancing scooter and go as fast as he could right to the edge of the building and stop just short. And over again, he'd go right to the edge and stop, where he's literally an inch away from tumbling off the edge. Or he'd line himself up where he knew exactly how far he was from the edge, and he would do these really aggressive somersaults forward, and he would stop with his legs dangling off the edge of the building. And of course, all of these trademark moves were done without any safety equipment, and most times Woo did these stunts without anybody there to potentially pull him back up if he gets stuck. About 3/4 of the way through 2017, Woo had posted over 500 videos and live streaming clips to various social media sites, and he was starting to make some real money off of it. On one video sharing site alone, he had made over $80,000 just from donations that had come in. And so it was clear this was becoming a career. But as the money and the fame were coming into Woo, he started to realize that in order for him to stay on top and keep earning at this level, he would need to continuously outperform his last big stunt. And already he was brushing up against death on virtually every video he took. In early November of that year, Woo heard about a competition that was offering $15,000 to its winner. The details of this competition are hazy at best, but from the sounds of it, it was a viral video competition. Make the most viral video and you win the prize. This competition served as motivation for Woo to finally attempt his craziest stunt yet. He figured if he had the footage of this particular stunt, he was sure to win this competition, and with the prize money, he could pay for his wedding and cover his mother's medical expenses. And so on November 8th, Woo traveled to the Huaiyan International Center in central China. This massive 62-story skyscraper would be the tallest building Woo had ever performed a stunt on. The public was only able to get up to the 44th floor, and so Woo had to take the elevator up to somewhere between the 40th and 44th floor, at which point he climbed out of a window and free climbed his way all the way up to the top, so 20 additional floors just climbing the side of a skyscraper. Once he got to the rooftop, he set up his tripod and his camera and he turned on his live stream. And then he walked around and he began preparing himself for the stunt. Live stream viewers that tuned in would see Woo sitting on the edge of the skyscraper, and he's meticulously wiping down the edge of this building. It's the area he'll be grabbing onto to perform his stunt, which was going to be his trademark pull-ups. And so after several minutes of Woo cleaning this ledge, he begins to lower himself where his arms are still tucked up over the ledge. So he's not hanging, he's got his arms kind of anchored on the top. He's like testing the edge of this lip. And he kind of feels around and he can tell that it's not a good grip. It's not good enough for him to go down to a full extension. And so he pulls himself back up and he goes back to wiping down the edge. And from the looks of it, it seems like Woo is actually pretty nervous about this stunt. And normally when you watch Woo's videos, he doesn't seem nervous at all, even leading up to his stunt. But this one just seemed different. And so after again wiping down this ledge as much as he possibly could, he gets himself ready, lowers himself onto his arms, he lets his legs drop over the edge of the building, and then he goes to full extension. And from there, he does 2 complete pull-ups, and then after the second pull-up, he begins to try to pull himself back up to safety. But he's fatigued and he can't quite get himself up over the edge. He starts to use his feet to try to use the glass to push himself back up, but he can't get a grip. And for the next 15 seconds, Woo is desperately trying to get himself up and over this ledge. He's trying to muscle himself up, but it's obvious he's completely fatigued. I mean, he did free climb almost 20 stories to get up there, and so it makes sense his arms would be tired. But there's nobody up there to help pull him up. And so after a while, he goes back to full extension because he can't do anything, and he looks down as if he's sizing up if he can survive this fall, which he obviously can't. And then the camera picks up a sort of whimpering sound that appears to come from Woo, and then he loses his grip and he falls to his death. In the early 1970s, a man named Marshall Applewhite was fired from his music teaching job for having an inappropriate relationship with a male student. Shortly after, he admitted himself into a psychiatric institution where he met a nurse who worked there named Bonnie Nettles. Both had a deep interest in biblical prophecy, and Applewhite, after meeting Nettles, was convinced they had met in a previous life. Nettles agreed and took it a step further, saying extraterrestrials had come to her and preordained that she would someday meet Applewhite. The two did not have a romantic relationship at all. It was strictly platonic. They bonded over a desire to ascend to a higher level of existence and ultimately reach the kingdom of heaven. Applewhite began calling himself Bo, and Nettles became Peep, and together they would start an infamous cult known as Heaven's Gate. The premise of Heaven's Gate was that an alien spacecraft that they simply called the UFO was going to come to Earth and whisk away Heaven's Gate cult members, elevating them to a new world and a better life that they referred to as Tela, or the evolutionary level above human. There was a catch though. Anybody on Earth who did not get on the UFO whenever it got here would be recycled, i.e. destroyed, along with everybody else on Earth, and then at some point a new human population would grow and another UFO would come, and whoever got on that would be saved over and over and over again. That was just how it worked. And Bo and Peep were telling everyone they talked to about Heaven's Gate that we're already in end times. Apparently there were signs that this UFO is going to be here any day. And so now is the time to join the cult. And so by 1975, Bo and Peep had recruited 20 people to be a part of their cult, which meant they gave up their families, they gave up their possessions, they basically gave up everything in their life and moved to Colorado to live in total poverty as they waited for this UFO to arrive. For 10 years, cult members waited and waited for this UFO that never showed up. And Bo and Peep are aggressively reminding people that this is the path, you just gotta stay the path. And then Peep unexpectedly died of cancer in 1985, which really screwed things up for the cult. In their doctrine, it was destiny that Bo and Peep would get on that UFO and make their way to Tela, the evolutionary level above human. That was their destiny. And now Peep has died on planet Earth. She did not get on the UFO. She did not ascend to Tela. She will not get to Heaven's Gate. Bo was devastated and horribly depressed, and it wasn't really clear what was going to happen to Heaven's Gate. But he composed himself and he began to tweak his messaging a little bit. Bo began telling his followers that Peep had in fact ascended to Tela. Yes, she did not get on the UFO. However, the aliens must have given her a signal that if she leaves behind this human body, this mere vessel, you'll still ascend to Tela. Basically, he was preaching to them, if you just end your own life at the right moment, you can go to Tela too. But Bo didn't really know what the right moment was. He didn't know what the trigger was going to be. Until 1995, when astronomers discovered the Hale-Bopp comet was going to be passing by Earth 2 years later in 1997. And Bo saw this as the trigger. The UFO was going to be hiding behind the trail of this comet, and for sure, Peep was riding on that UFO, and as soon as it passes by Earth, we need to ascend. And so fast forward to March 26, 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet passed by Earth, 39 of the Heaven's Gate cult members, including Bo, they began their journey. Bo told them they would be exiting the Earth in 3 groups. And so on March 26th, Group 1 entered their San Diego mansion and consumed applesauce mixed with barbiturates, followed it up with a whole bunch of vodka, and then put a bag over their head and waited for death. Then on March 27th, Group 2 entered the San Diego mansion, knowing full well what they were walking into. They all had specific jobs of how they were going to clean up the mess left from Group 1. They cleaned it up. Then they picked up the Group 1 members and placed them in beds and put a purple cloth over their face before they, Group 2, consumed their own applesauce mixed with barbiturates and put a bag over their head and waited for death. On March 28th, the 3rd group entered the San Diego mansion, and this included Bo, and they did the same cleanup as Group 2. They put the Group 2 deceased members in bed as well, and then they consumed applesauce and barbiturates, followed it up with vodka, bag over their head, waited for death. Bo had given special instructions to 2 of the members that were within that third group to wait until he had exited Earth and take special care to put him in a specific bed, organized a certain way, and then when they consumed their own applesauce and barbiturates followed up with vodka, they should do that in their bed because they're the last 2. There's nobody else to move them. When a former cult member stopped by the San Diego mansion to check in on the cult, they went inside not knowing what they were up to and found all 39 cult members deceased, laying in bunk beds with identical black and white Nike running shoes on their feet with purple shrouds over their bodies, and they were all wearing matching armbands that read Heaven's Gate Away Team. Just hours before they exited the Earth, each of the groups would perform exit interviews where they would record themselves talking about why they were doing this, why it was important, and what they expected on the other side. They are remarkably cheerful and happy considering what they all know they are about to do. Here are some highlights from those exit interviews.
Okay, we have Thursody with us, and I believe that you chose the name Thursody because you wanted to be reminded of your thirst for next level knowledge. Is that correct?
That's right. I know my vehicle's, or this vehicle that I'm wearing is, pretty nervous, pretty scared. Some may say, well, boy, it's quite a irreversible step.
This isn't a troubling circumstance. Don't take it as that. It's just a gateway, just a doorway.
Okay, thank you.
Now you're going to find this old crummy vehicle in a bunk someplace that I'll probably be watching when you check it out and observe your responses and your reaction when you look at these vehicles. And they're all nothing but containers that we've used and bored for the short amount of time.
People in the world who thought that I had completely lost my marbles. They're not right.
In the late 1940s and 1950s, Reverend Jim Jones was known for his charitable works and his efforts towards desegregating Indiana. This earned him a devoted, loyal following, in particular from the African American community. In 1956, he purchased a church in Indiana and he named it the People's Temple, and all of his loyal followers went there and joined his congregation. During his fiery sermons, Jones emphasized helping the poor and lifting up the downtrodden, but despite his best efforts, raising money was proving to be a big challenge for him. Jones knew he was an amazing performer and he was really good on stage, and so instead of trying to do all the old school church fundraising techniques, he decided to do something a little more new school that played to his strengths, which was performance. And so what he started doing is advertising that he could perform miracles, live miracles on stage. And specifically what he said he could do is he could pull cancer out of people. And he had this magic trick where he would go up to somebody that had cancer and he would appear to be pulling on them, and then he would pull out what looked like meat from this person. And it was meat. It was chicken meat. And he made it seem like he had removed the cancer, and people loved it. And his congregation swelled immediately and money was pouring in. And it was around this time that Jones began to realize the power of his own influence. He could make his followers believe anything he wanted. This power trip, though, over time would cause Jones to lose his grip on reality. And so when he began espousing fairly radical views, he didn't have anybody that was going to stand up and say, I don't know if you're right about that. Instead, he had a mass of people that basically blindly agreed with him. But when his social goals became so radical that they attracted Marxist leaders and violent leftist groups to the People's Temple, it was the one time that his followers said, okay, enough is enough. And there was a mass defection out of the People's Temple. And some of these defectors, when they left and had a chance to kind of look at the People's Temple for what it was, they realized it was more like a cult, and that they had been brainwashed, and that Jim Jones was a lunatic, and anybody who followed him could potentially be in danger. And so they went to the media and told them about this. The media converges on the People's Temple, and all of a sudden it's this huge scandal that Jim Jones is the leader of a cult. And as stories started to break about Jim Jones being this awful person who was stealing from his members and abusing them and brainwashing them, he up and leaves for South America with hundreds of his most loyal followers, and they resettle in an area called Guyana that would eventually be called Jonestown. Life on the Jonestown compound was very grim. Not only did they have 10-hour workdays every day of the week, but food and water were extremely limited because they were so cut off from modern society that the only way they could get any sort of resources was through haggling over a shortwave radio that usually didn't even work. So they're totally cut off, they have very few supplies, and then at the end of their 10-hour workday, it was mandatory for all members to come into this main area underneath this big scaffolding where Jim Jones would get up on stage and he would rant and rave about various government conspiracies that were going to befall them. He would excoriate defectors and talk about how they needed to round them up and make examples of them. And if you stepped out of line, even just a little bit, you could find yourself locked inside of a coffin or trapped at the bottom of a well as a form of punishment. Jones was already spiraling out of control, but some health issues led him to take a daily, near lethal dose of amphetamines and sedatives that made him a total lunatic. Suddenly, his nighttime speeches just weren't enough, and he began pumping these crazy speeches 24/7 over loudspeakers all over the camp. One defector said the speeches were centered on this idea that back in the United States, the government was systematically rounding up African Americans and sending them to concentration camps. And it was only a matter of time before they came here and took any of the African Americans here into captivity. And since the majority of the People's Temple were of African American descent, this was terrifying. U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan had been keeping close tabs on the People's Temple ever since the news broke about Jim Jones kind of being a hack and a maniac. And when they went to South America, he just felt like no one's really checking in on them, and I'm concerned for the well-being of the people that are there. And so on November 18th, 1978, Ryan, along with 18 other people, flew to Guyana to talk to Jim Jones and to make sure that everything was okay. When he arrived, he was expecting it to be kind of in disrepair and be this chaotic scene, but it wasn't. The camp was maintained, people were well-dressed, polite. It seemed like a happy and healthy community with a few hundred people there. And he actually went to Jim Jones and says, you know, it looks like you got a good thing going here. But Jones, in his totally delusional state, believed Ryan was being sent by the US government to round up the members and to ship them into concentration camps. And so as soon as the congressman left the camp and was headed back to the airport, Jones sent a security team after them and they shot and killed Leo Ryan along with 4 others. While that massacre is going on, Jones goes over to the middle of the camp where he normally gives his nighttime speeches, and he calls all 900 plus members to the middle of camp to listen to him. He turns on a recording device, he picks up his microphone, and he delivers a speech that would come to be known as the death tape. His famous first line of this speech is, "I've tried my best to give you a good life." And you can hear the crowd erupt with cheers as he says this, and what listeners of this tape can't see is what's being unveiled at the same time. Right next to Jim Jones is this silver cauldron of this sickly purple liquid, and next to it are about 900 cups. The next day, authorities are outside the gate of Jonestown, and they're getting ready to head into Jonestown to confront Jim Jones about his connection to the murder of Congressman Ryan and the 4 others. And they're loading their guns, they're getting ready for what's bound to be massive resistance from this crazy cult leader and his followers. And as they're making their way down the road and the camp comes into view, they notice that it's eerily quiet and they don't see anybody moving around. And as they're walking through some of the high grass, someone trips and falls, and they think they've stepped on a log. But when they stand up and look down, they notice that it's a dead person, and they scream out, and then everyone's looking around, and they notice that all over the ground in front of them are hundreds and hundreds of dead bodies. There's more bodies than they can possibly count. The previous night, that purple liquid that was revealed to the crowd after Jim Jones begins his speech was Kool-Aid mixed with cyanide. And over the course of several hours, and it's all recorded on the death tape, he encourages his members to come up and die with dignity and drink the Kool-Aid. However, if you didn't drink the Kool-Aid or didn't want to drink the Kool-Aid, like many of the 300 children, their parents would make them or the armed guards would come over and they would inject them with it. And after everybody's died, Jim Jones doesn't even drink from the Kool-Aid. He ends up shooting himself. I've decided to only include a very small portion of the death tape because so much of it is just, it's heartbreaking, it's distressing, and it should be something that you decide you want to listen to. It should not be thrust upon you.
How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. It was said by the greatest of prophets, from time immemorial, no man takes my life from me, I lay my life down. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. We've been so betrayed. We have been so terribly betrayed. Take the portion like they used to take in ancient Greece and step over quietly, because we are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act. We can't go back. They won't leave us alone. They're now going back to tell more lies, which means more congressmen, and there's no way.
At 3:30 p.m. on July 27, 2019, a 22-year-old college student named Nicole logged onto her gaming computer in her bedroom in North Carolina. Nicole had spent the morning and the early part of the afternoon studying, but now she could finally kick back and relax and play her favorite video game, an online multiplayer combat game called Perfect World, where people battled each other as characters inspired by Chinese mythology. Perfect World was a pretty niche game, so not a whole lot of people played it or even knew about it, but Nicole loved it, and she played it basically every day for the past few years, was totally hooked on it, and in playing it, she had met about a dozen other people from all over the world who also were obsessed with this game. And together, they had formed a virtual community, and they used a messaging app called Discord to communicate with each other outside of the game. So, on this particular day, after Nicole loaded up Perfect World, she also opened up her Discord chat, and she saw already that several of her friends were online, and they were all talking on the general chat inside of their server. And so Nicole began perusing the messages, and she saw the general theme of the messages being passed was about one of the other users on their server, somebody who went by the username Menhaz. So as far as everyone knew on this Discord server, Menhaz, they didn't know his real name, was a college student, and he was basically known to be a huge troll, which meant he said and did really offensive things, in particular on this Discord server, just to get people's reactions. Because of his trolling behavior, he had actually been previously kicked out of the server and also kicked out of the game Perfect World, like the game they're all connected on this Discord server through. He had been booted from both of those platforms in the past, but in previous occasions when that happened, Menhaz would plead his case and say he's not going to do it anymore, he's going to behave, and eventually the moderators would just let him back in. And so currently, Menhaz was back on the Discord server, and he was back to his trolling ways. But as Nicole scanned through the general chat and went back and actually saw what Menhaz had been saying that day, that basically had stirred up everybody else on the server to say, look, he's back to his trolling ways, when she went back and actually saw what Menhaz was saying, Nicole couldn't help but feel like today's trolling just felt different. Menhaz was talking about this apparently brilliant 4-step plan he had that was going to completely revolutionize his life and basically set him up for big success in his life going forward. However, this plan he was talking about, this 4-step plan, was not only totally outrageous, but just seemed impossible. Like what he was saying he was going to do just didn't seem possible even by Menhaz's standards. Like within his trolling standards, this was a bridge too far. Like this isn't even trolling, this is just weird what you're proposing. And so basically the chatter on the Discord server this day that Nicole was seeing was how nobody believed this 4-step plan was a real thing. Like this is just classic Menhaz trolling. And Nicole too, she also did not believe this plan was serious. She did not think for a second Menhaz was going to do this. And so she just kind of rolled her eyes, ignored Menhaz, minimized the Discord server, and just enjoyed playing the game, Perfect World. And after a while, after a couple of battles that she won and a couple of battles that she lost in this game, she paused for a second and noticed there was a whole bunch of new notifications on their Discord server. And so because Nicole was already taking a break from the game, she opened up the Discord server to see what was going on. And right away she saw the main topic of discussion was once again Menhaz and his 4-step plan, but specifically, Menhaz had just sent a picture through the Discord server that apparently represented completing step 1 of this 4-step plan. He basically said, look, I did it. I've done 1. I'm on to step 2 now. And everybody's looking at this picture thinking, wait a minute, he's actually doing this? This can't be real. And Nicole, when she looked at this picture, she too thought like, no way, this is not possible. He did not do this. And in fact, her first thought was, okay, maybe this image was, created by AI or something, or, maybe he pulled this image off a website somewhere and is pretending it's authentic, but it can't possibly be something he actually took a picture of. He couldn't have done this. And so pretty quickly, Nicole, despite seeing this image, she agreed with the consensus that Menhaz is still just trolling us. This picture is not proof that he's really doing this 4-step plan. And so Nicole went back to playing Perfect World, and about an hour later, she noticed there were all sorts of new notifications on her Discord server. And so once again, she stopped her game, she opened up the Discord server, and once again, the entire chat was dominated about Menhaz, because Menhaz had sent a second picture, apparently representing him completing the second step of his big 4-step plan. And once again, everyone's saying there's no way, he's trolling us, this can't be real. And Nicole, she looked at the image itself, and she too thought this has got to be trolling. But now, she wasn't just filled with pure disbelief. She wasn't able to just completely discard what was happening here, because part of her was thinking, like, how is Menhaz getting these hyper-specific images that really are tethered to this exact plan he's laid out? Like, how does he have these images? Where are they coming from? Now, this was back in 2019, and certainly AI technology existed, but not the way it does now, where, the average user can literally in seconds create hyper-specific images using AI. In 2019, that really wasn't available to most people, and so really the only way Menhaz could potentially have these images, at least in Nicole's mind, was he had to have pulled them off some website somewhere and basically pretended they were images that he took. And so Nicole decided she was actually going to take the 2 images he had sent and reverse image search them to try to figure out where they came from, find the website, where he's pulling them from, because clearly these pictures are not authentic. There's no way Menhaz actually took these photos. But when Nicole reverse image searched both images, nothing came up. Now, Nicole thought, okay, that does seem to suggest these are authentic pictures he really did take, which maybe means he's actually doing this plan, even though that seemed totally preposterous. Or she thought maybe, these images have been pulled from such an obscure website somewhere that I don't have access to, finding them in a reverse image search, that maybe that's what it is. And so at this point, Nicole told herself, you know what, there's got to be a reasonable explanation for this, but I'll tell you this, it can't be that Menhaz is actually following through on this plan. It's not possible. And so once again, she minimized the Discord server and got back into the game. But pretty quickly, Nicole just stopped playing the game because her mind was totally fixated on whatever was going on with Menhaz. And so she opened up the Discord server again, and she saw still everybody in the chat was talking about Menhaz and these 2 pictures he had sent. And basically the server was divided. About half the members believed this really was just Menhaz trolling, and the other half was starting to think that, hey guys, this might be real. He might actually be carrying out this 4-step plan. Those pictures might be real. And if that's the case, we have a huge problem. Because this plan, if he actually carries it out, is so completely illegal. He can't do this. This is not okay. And so the faction of members on the Discord server that were starting to sense that this 4-step plan of Menhaz's might actually be real began to talk internally, and they said, look, like, we can't just sit here and do nothing if Menhaz is actually doing this. We have to stop him. This is not okay. And so in fact, one of these members actually contacted their local police and told them, hey, there's this guy on my Discord server, his username is Menhaz, I don't have his actual name, but he's doing something that could be very bad, and you need to look into it. And so the dispatcher said, okay, well, where does Menhaz live? And the person who had called was like, well, I don't actually know. In fact, I really don't know much about him other than the fact that he goes by Menhaz and he sent these crazy pictures that could be real or not, I don't know. And so eventually the dispatcher just said, look, like, I get it that you're concerned, but we have nothing to go on here. And remember, this is the internet. People make stuff up all the time. And so pretty quickly after that, the police officer just hung up, and that was that. So at this point, Nicole and the other members of the Discord server who were starting to suspect that what Menhaz was doing could be real, at this point, they felt really alone. I mean, the local police was not taking this seriously, which did make sense. I mean, they had nothing to go on. But as a result, it was like nobody was doing anything about what Menhaz was claiming. And Nicole and the other members who, again, were beginning to sense this could be real, they felt terrible about just sitting here doing nothing. And so Nicole and a few other members of the Discord server decided to team up digitally and actually investigate Menhaz themselves, try to figure out like who this guy is and really what's he up to. And so Nicole and this new investigative group started by combing through all the chat logs in their Discord server to see if Menhaz at any point had either intentionally or unintentionally dropped hints about his real name and his location. And eventually, they came across a message where Menhaz actually said his real first name was Menhaz. That wasn't just his username, that was his real name. And that was great because Menhaz was a pretty unique name. And so Nicole and the group thought, okay, well, if we find where in the world that name is somewhat common, maybe that will give us a rough idea of where to look for Menhaz in the world. They also knew that Menhaz was a college student, or at least he claimed to be. Now, he never actually said where he went to college, but he would often, in the Discord server, tell people when he was going to be on the server and when he was going to be off the server, like for classes and for studying and that kind of thing. He would say, okay, hey, I'll be on at 6 p.m. tonight, or I'll be off at 9, I'll be back on at 8. He would give these specific times, and he would always use Eastern Standard Time when he did that. And so a natural assumption that Nicole and her group made was, okay, very likely Menhaz lives in the Eastern time zone. And that time zone included the entire East Coast of the United States, Eastern and Central Canada, and also some countries in South and Central America. But while that was helpful, it still created too broad of an area in the world for this group to realistically look for Menhaz. It was nearly impossible to actually figure out where he was. But they now had a sense of where he could be, and they thought, okay, well, why don't we ask somebody else in the Discord server if they can try to track Menhaz's IP address? An IP address can be used to find the approximate geographical location of a computer. And sure enough, someone in the server said they could do that, and within a few minutes, they had tracked Menhaz's computer to Toronto, Canada. However, right at the same time they were figuring this out, Menhaz sent a third picture across the Discord server, a picture that showcased him completing step 3 of this 4-step plan, allegedly. And for Nicole and many other members of this Discord server, this third picture really represented a big shift, because now it was getting terrifying. Because look, it seems pretty likely at this point that Menhaz is actually doing this. This is real. How could he possibly have these hyper-specific photos that are perfectly synced with this 4-step plan he had come up with? This feels real. And so Nicole, she actually asked the person who had traced his IP address to Toronto, she said, hey, should we call the Toronto police and tell them what's going on here? You know, maybe they can go find him and stop him before he completes this plan. I mean, he's apparently completed 3 steps. There's only 1 step left. We have to stop him here. But the person who had tracked his IP address to Toronto said, look, what are the police going to do? There's 6 million people that live in Toronto, and all we have is that maybe his computer is in Toronto and maybe these pictures are real. And also, by the way, it's pretty easy to mask your IP address. You can use something called a VPN, or virtual private network, that when you track someone's IP address that has one of those working, it will make it seem like their address is, for example, in Toronto or Chicago or New York or Dallas or anywhere in the world, when in reality, their computer is somewhere totally different. And so the police are not going to launch a manhunt based on an IP address. It's not 100% accurate. And so basically, Nicole realized that even though they saw they are on the precipice, potentially, of Menhaz committing some horrible crime, and they can't do anything about it because they don't really have any information about Menhaz. And so at this point, everybody on the Discord server was basically begging Menhaz to come clean. Tell us these photos are fake. Tell us this plan of yours is really just you trolling. But Menhaz didn't do that. He doubled down and said, oh no, these are all real. And in fact, I'm going to complete step 4 of this plan and complete the whole process in 30 minutes. And after that, all Nicole and the other members of the Discord server could do was just try to convince Menhaz not to do this. Don't follow through with this. Don't complete the plan. You gotta stop. It's not worth it. But Menhaz refused and said, I'm doing this no matter what. And sure enough, 30 minutes later, Menhaz would send one final picture, the 4th picture, showcasing that his 4-step plan was now complete. At this point, someone from the Discord server did call the Toronto police. The following day, at about 3:30 p.m., police officers arrived outside of Menhaz's home, which it would turn out was located in a small town just north of Toronto. The IP address had been correct. By this point, it had now been about 24 hours since Menhaz had sent the very first picture of his four-step plan. Police knocked on the front door, having no idea what to expect here. They had seen the images Menhaz had sent on the Discord server, but at this point, until they went inside, they had no idea if they were dealing with a terrible crime or a terrible joke. When the door opened, Menhaz himself was standing in the doorway. He had a totally neutral, very calm expression on his face. He was very gracious. He welcomed the police inside. And when they stepped inside, they asked him, what's going on here? And all Menhaz said was, "You'll see." So the police walked further into the home and eventually made their way upstairs. And when they got up there, they just froze. Because it would turn out, Menhaz was not trolling. Those pictures were not fake. He really had carried out that four-step plan. It would turn out, for the past 4 years, Menhaz had been living a double life. To his friends and family, he was a college student studying engineering, and he was on a path to great success. When in reality, he dropped out of college in his first year and just pretended to go to school every day, when in reality, he would just go to a local mall and hang out there, and then in the evenings, when school was over and he would come back home, he would just immerse himself in video games, specifically that Perfect World game. That's what he did. He just went to the mall and played video games and lied to his friends and family. But July 27th, 2019, the day Menhaz put his four-step plan into action, was literally the last day he could maintain this ruse. Because the next day, July 28th, 2019, was the day Menhaz was scheduled to graduate from his college. And so his friends and family were all expecting to be there and to see this amazing ceremony. And so to deal with the fact that his real life and his fake life were about to collide, Menhaz came up with his four-step plan. And he literally told the members of the Discord server about his big plan, but nobody believed him because he was always trolling people. It just seemed like, oh, this is made up, another one of Menhaz's lies. But he was not lying. It was all true. Those pictures that he sent across were absolutely authentic. He took those pictures, and they did represent completing each step in the plan. The first picture was of his mother, the second picture was of his grandmother, the third picture was of his sister, and the fourth picture was of his father. And in each picture, those people were dead, because Menhaz had spent the day methodically killing his entire family to prevent them finding out about his lie. He hit them over the head with a crowbar and then slit their throats and took a picture, posted it to Discord. By the time someone from Discord finally got in touch with the Toronto police, it was too late. Menhaz had obliterated his entire family. Menhaz ultimately pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. On the afternoon of April 17, 2003, 33-year-old John Parker Jr. sat at his desk in his office at J&J Parker Industries in Maryville, Indiana. He was looking over some paperwork and hoping he would get at least a few minutes without any interruptions to finish reading it. Because in John's world, a few minutes were hard to find. John was the owner of J&J, which was a consulting company dedicated to training people to sell high-end vacuums. Now, vacuums were not glamorous, but his company was really successful, and running it was a lot of work. He was on his feet all day, managing about 25 employees and solving constant problems, and he usually did not get much quiet time to do things like paperwork. And even though John did complain about this, the truth was he actually loved being busy. He had always been a very hard worker. He'd started in the vacuum business as a door-to-door salesman, and even though everyone told him there was no money in vacuums, he'd proved them wrong. He was so good at sales that he made his first $1 million by the time he was just 30 years old. And now he had a whole company that taught other people how to be great at it too. But now, as John tried to get through the paperwork, his desk phone rang. He sighed and he picked it up, and it was his wife, Judy. She told him that their daughter had left her homework in his office when she was there just the other day, and she asked him if he could bring it home with him. Now, John was about to tell his wife that this was now the second time she had reminded him about this homework, but he stopped himself because right now things were pretty good. Things between them were solid, and so he tried to remind himself that it was not worth messing that up. So John and Judy had been married for 10 years, and she was his partner in life and in business. They had raised 4 kids together, and Judy was actually the second J in J&J Parker Industries. John knew that to everyone else they looked like a happy, successful power couple, but the truth was much more complicated, because about a year ago, Judy had an affair. And this had devastated John at the time, but he really wanted to give their marriage another shot. They'd been living in Michigan at the time, and they agreed that moving the business to Maryville, Indiana, where John was from, would be a good way to start fresh. And so far, they both felt like it had been the right call. The business was doing really well, things were looking up, and most importantly, John and Judy were actually getting along. So now, instead of getting annoyed at his wife for repeatedly asking him about the homework, he just said, sure, and that he would see her later for their date night. As soon as John hung up with Judy, he heard a knock on the door, and his office manager, Barry Jones, charged in holding more files. Barry dropped them on John's desk and said sorry, but he needed a signature. It was for the final termination paperwork for an employee John fired, whose name was Derek Hall. So a week earlier, John had made the very difficult decision to let Derek go. It wasn't personal. Derek just wasn't a good fit. He couldn't keep up with the sales quota. And John had really high standards for his employees. That's how he became a millionaire in the first place. But Derek somehow thought his firing was John's fault, and he'd actually showed up at J&J and made a scene in the parking lot saying that John had shorted him hundreds of dollars on his last paycheck. And when John tried to defuse things, Derek had physically attacked him. The police had to be called, and they separated John and Derek before it got too ugly. And John had ended up paying Derek what he wanted, since he just wanted the whole thing to be over, which was also why now he was immediately scribbling his signature on the termination paperwork and handing it back to Barry, because hopefully now he would just never have to see or speak to Derek ever again. After work, around 6 p.m., John drove home, which was about 15 minutes away from the office. And when he got inside his house, he heard Judy call down from upstairs that she'd be ready soon. So he yelled back that there was no rush, and he meant it. And this was because just over an hour earlier, his older brother David had met him at the office, and they'd gone to a buffet together. So John really wasn't hungry at all anymore. But dinner with Judy was definitely more about spending time together than actually eating, so he wasn't going to say anything about the late lunch. John made his way into the living room where his 4 kids were watching TV. It was his 17-year-old daughter, Christina, her 15-year-old brother, Daniel, and their 2 younger sisters. The older kids were going to babysit the younger ones tonight so that he and Judy could go out. But when John tried to make conversation with them, Christina and Daniel gave him the cold shoulder. Now, to any other parent, this could be interpreted perhaps as just typical teenage behavior. But to John, it was more loaded than that. So Christina and Daniel were actually his stepkids. John had been in their life since they were really little, and he considered himself to be their dad. And John had always tried to be very involved in things like coaching Daniel in baseball and going to school concerts and parent-teacher conferences. But his relationship with these kids had changed lately. And frankly, both of the kids had really begun acting out. Christina repeatedly threw parties at their house whenever he and Judy were gone, while Daniel was combative and hung out with a group of friends who were seemingly always in trouble with the law. And this had created a lot of conflict between them and John, because he was the one who tried to discipline them, while Judy sort of always played the good cop. But John knew better than to try and force them to talk to him. So when he went in there, he just kept quiet and they all watched the TV until Judy came downstairs and said she was ready to go. Hours later, just before 10 p.m., John and Judy left their dinner, got in the car, and drove back to John's office at J&J Parker Industries, which was in an office park in a secluded area. And the 2 of them had had a really nice dinner. However, during their meal, Christina had called and wanted to know where that homework was that John was supposed to bring home. And John, very embarrassingly, suddenly realized that despite all those reminders from Judy that he was getting so annoyed by, he had forgotten the homework at the office. So that's why they were here now, to pick up the homework on their way home. John parked the car in the lot and both of them hopped out. When they got inside the building, they found that the office manager, Barry, was still there working, which John expected. I mean, things had been busy lately with planning seminars and finding a new hire to replace Derek, and Barry was in charge of keeping it all organized. And John really didn't feel too bad that Barry was putting in so many hours. I mean, this was his job, and the company relied on him to ensure nothing major slipped through the cracks. So when Barry mentioned to John when he went inside that, he actually might be heading home soon, John said no. At the same time, John saw his wife grab the homework from his desk and then hustle out to the car, and as she disappeared, John told Barry that he was sorry, but Barry needed to stay and finish what he was doing. But then, to make up for delivering this bad news, John offered Barry his leftovers from dinner. He had basically a full meal since he had not been hungry. Barry sort of grumbled about it, but said he would take the food if he was offering, and so John nodded and went outside to grab it. Moments later, John arrived at the car, where Judy was waiting in the passenger seat. He opened up the back door, and he picked up the styrofoam to-go box. When Judy looked back at him, he told her he was going back to give the food to Barry, and she just shrugged and said, fine, then turned back around. But right at that same moment, John heard the sound of footsteps on the concrete right behind him. But before he could turn around, he heard a deafening bang. Judy heard the bang too, which was followed quickly by a second one, and she instinctively ducked down in her seat and then looked back at John just in time to see him fall hard to the ground. And before she could do or say anything, she saw a masked person in dark clothes crouch over John for just a few seconds, and then they sprinted away from the car towards the main road. Judy leapt out of the car and ran to John, yelling his name, but he just lay there on the pavement, not moving. And then she saw this huge pool of blood forming right underneath his head. With her heart racing, Judy ran to the office door and screamed at Barry to call the police. By about 10:30 that night, the parking lot at J&J Parker Industries was overrun with officers and crime scene technicians. Among them was Detective Donald Toth, who had been with the Maryville Police Department for the last 21 years. When he first got the call, dispatch had only known that there was a shooting, but when he arrived on the scene, a first responder told him that there'd actually been a fatality. 33-year-old John Parker Jr., who had been identified by two witnesses at the scene. The first responder also explained that when they got there, before they spoke to the witnesses, they had looked for John's wallet to identify him, but the wallet had not been in his pockets or in the car. And when Toth heard that, his first thought was that maybe this was a robbery. But as soon as he walked over and got a look at John, he immediately revised that theory. John was on his back behind a parked car, and the first thing Toth noticed was that he had a lot of nice jewelry on. Gold and diamond rings, a bracelet, and an expensive-looking Rolex watch. Also, this office park was not close to anything, and it just didn't feel like the kind of place a random mugger would go looking for victims. Toth wondered if the killer took the wallet just to make police believe this could be a robbery. Because the longer he looked at John's body, the more signs he saw that this was likely an efficient, planned execution. John didn't have any visible defensive wounds, and when Toth used a gloved hand to move John's head to the side, he saw a gunshot wound right behind his ear. Toth had actually been a paramedic before becoming a detective, so he knew that shot had likely killed John instantly. It also meant John had his back turned to the shooter when he died. There was an open styrofoam to-go container of food and some car keys on the ground right next to John's body, and their placement made it feel like John might have been holding them when he fell. If John had an altercation, like with a thief or somebody who killed him in the heat of the moment, the scene would be way messier. As far as Toth could tell, the killer had just walked up to John while he was busy with something at his car, aimed the gun, pulled the trigger, and then after he died, grabbed John's wallet and then left. Which also meant the killer very likely had not been at the scene long enough to leave behind much evidence. All Toth saw were just two shell casings, and he doubted there would be footprints or DNA. And when Toth spoke to some of the other officers at the scene, he learned they'd already done a sweep of the office park, and they'd looked in dumpsters and bushes and on the roofs of all the buildings, but they hadn't found anything, and they didn't see any cameras or surveillance in the area. So, as Toth stood in the middle of the parking lot and watched his officers continue to search the scene, he realized he was the lead on a case with virtually no forensic evidence, which might have been daunting, but he did have at least two witnesses. About an hour later, Toth sat down across a table from John Parker's wife, Judy, inside of an interrogation room inside the Maryville police station. He'd learned a few things about Judy already. She'd been the one who told Barry to call the police, and she was with John when he was shot. He also knew that, as the spouse of the murder victim, she was his best suspect, Now, Toth didn't really think Judy was the actual shooter, but considering how pristine the crime scene was, he knew it was possible this was a hit done by a professional, and Judy maybe could have hired them. But as Toth spoke to Judy, he started to waver on that theory. She couldn't stop crying, which made it hard for her to get her words out, and when she did speak, it was slow, like it was taking her a lot of effort to say anything at all. She did manage to give Toth a timeline, how she and John had gone out to dinner for their date, and then stopped over at the office after, since one of their daughters had left some homework there. She said the office manager, Barry, had been there, and that when she had gone back to the car, she knew that Barry and John were speaking. And then at some point, John, he left the building and came out to get his dinner leftovers, and at that time, she had turned away from him, and then she heard these 2 loud shots. And then when she turned back around, she saw John fall, and then also there was this figure in dark clothes who was sort of bending down on top of John, and then they ran away. However, when Judy finished telling her story about what had happened that night, all the events that led up to the shooting, something changed in her demeanor. The shakiness in her voice and all the grief that was sort of pouring out of her to this point, it vanished. And in its place, Judy became very hardened, and she looked right at Toth, and she said, "You better find the person who did this and bring them to justice." And when Toth saw this, he almost got goosebumps from it because it was such a quick departure from what had been going on. And he thought to himself, either she is a great actress and this is all a big facade and she did it or she was involved, or this is genuine. She's a grieving widow who doesn't know what to make of the fact that her husband has just been killed. At some point, Toth asked Judy if she could think of anybody who might have wanted to hurt John. And Judy appeared to think for a second, but eventually she just said no. She said that John was an incredible husband and father, and they had a great marriage that they had really worked hard on, and everybody at work respected him. But then something clearly occurred to Judy, because she frowned and said, actually, there was someone from work who didn't like John. His name was Derek, and John had fired him recently. And after the firing, Derek had come back to J&J and started a physical fight with John in the parking lot. When Toth heard that, he perked up. A disgruntled employee was definitely somebody that he should be speaking to. And Toth was speaking to the office manager, Barry Jones, right after this, and so he figured he could ask him about that incident too. Now, Toth wasn't ready to rule Judy out as a suspect, since he still needed to check her finances and talk to her friends and family about her marriage. But for now, he didn't see a reason to hold her. So he told Judy that for now, she was welcome to go home and be with her kids and grieve, and they would be in touch. Then Toth got up and he left to go to another interrogation room where Barry was waiting. The following morning, Toth walked up a flight of porch steps. He was at the home of Derek Hall, the ex-employee of J&J Parker Industries that John Parker had recently fired. Last night, Toth had spoken to John's office manager, Barry Jones, who had confirmed what John's wife Judy had said about Derek, that after he was fired, there had been this huge, ugly fight at the office between Derek and John, and Derek was the instigator. It was the only useful information Barry had given him, since he said, during the shooting, he had actually been in the bathroom, and so he hadn't heard or seen anything until he heard Judy screaming for him. But the lead on Derek was enough. And the other thing was, Barry and Judy were not the only ones who thought Derek might have killed John. Just before this, Toth also spoke to John's brother, David, who was incredibly devastated and furious about his brother's death. And David had also pointed the finger at Derek. So Toth was very eager to meet Derek, a man 3 people claimed could be a killer. Toth got to the top of the steps and knocked on the front door. And when Derek answered, Toth introduced himself and explained why he was there. Derek seemed stunned, but he immediately let Toth inside. Moments later, Toth was sitting across from Derek in the living room, and even though Derek seemed very uncomfortable and nervous, he told Toth he was actually glad the detective was there, because he really wanted to give his side of the story. Derek said that when he started working at J&J, he was given way more work than he'd expected, and when he couldn't keep up with it, he was fired. And then, John shorted him $400 on his final paycheck, so he had gone to J&J to get the money he was owed. Now, he admitted that it did lead to a physical fight, but he said they'd only pushed each other, and it ended up getting resolved, like it wasn't that big of a deal. But beyond that, Derek insisted he could not have killed John because he'd actually spent the whole evening last night at a friend's house playing video games. He gave Toth the friend's number and said, "Go ahead, call him, he'll confirm it." Toth tried not to look too disappointed as he took down this number. But if the alibi checked out, he could rule Derek out as a suspect. Now, it was possible that Derek had, actually taken a hit out on John, but to Toth, that seemed unlikely. If Derek was that upset over $400, it didn't seem likely that he would have the excess cash to pay anybody to go commit a murder. But as Toth left Derek's house and got back in his car, he decided the interview was not a total bust after all. Because talking to Derek made him realize he needed to focus more on John's business life. According to John's brother David, John got rich young and built his company very quickly. And in Toth's experience, those kinds of people often stepped on others to get to the top. The next day, Toth walked down a hallway at the precinct towards an interrogation room. He had confirmed Derek's alibi with his friend, so he had to move on to other suspects for now. Which was fine with Toth because he was about to sit down with his new prime suspect, who happened to be one of his former witnesses. It was John's office manager, Barry Jones. Yesterday, Toth had gone to the J&J Parker Industries office and made it a point to speak to every single employee about John. And he found out that John was a great boss who pushed his employees, but he worked hard himself. The employees also said that Judy was an essential part of the company, and the Parkers as a duo were well respected in the world of vacuum sales. But office gossip also said their marriage was not exactly happy, and it was sort of common knowledge that Judy was having an affair with Barry Jones. A few employees had even caught them having sex at the office. Now, neither Barry nor Judy had mentioned this the first time Toth had spoken to them, so now Toth had no idea if anything they had said to him was true. Barry could have been lying about being in the bathroom and was actually, the shooter. Or he and Judy were maybe working together and they were both lying. Toth was leaning towards the second option because he'd also found out that Judy was going to get a big payday from the death of her husband. She was the beneficiary of a $1 million life insurance policy. And aside from that, John's general estate was worth around $2 million. Maybe, he thought, she and Barry wanted to take John's money and run off together. So when Toth went into the interrogation room, he intended on essentially saying that the investigation was over. They'd caught Barry in a lie, and they knew what he did. But when Toth sat down and confronted him, Barry did not act like somebody who was guilty and cornered. He was charismatic and confident, and he said the affair was total office gossip. He was just good friends with Judy, and they worked together closely. Barry said he and Judy and John were like family. In fact, he said he was living with one of Judy's cousins from Texas. Now, Toth didn't really believe what Barry was saying, but even though he kept pressing him, Barry stuck to his story. And eventually, Toth just had to let him go. Because without any evidence, it was just Barry and Judy's word against the employees. And even if they were having an affair, that was not enough to prove they also conspired to murder John. On Monday, April 21st, so 4 days after John's murder, Toth was at his desk, rereading the notes from Barry and Judy's interviews for what felt like the millionth time. He was still trying to find a concrete way to link Judy and Barry to John's murder before approaching Judy about it. But so far, other than the office rumors, he hadn't found anything, and he didn't really have any other leads, aside from learning that the shell casings found on the scene were from a .25 caliber gun. Which was useful to know, but it wasn't going to help him with his suspect list. Toth leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He'd been full speed ahead on this case since Thursday night, and he was exhausted. He was starting to consider maybe going home and getting some rest when he heard a light knock on his door. An officer poked his head in and told Toth there was somebody on line 3 with a tip, and it sounded like a good one. Toth picked up his phone, and the person on the other end of the line explained they were a police officer as well from a nearby town, and they said that they had heard about John Parker's murder on the news and realized they had some information. So about 6 months earlier, this officer had been called to a local juvenile detention facility to take a report. The staff there had done a random search on their kids and found that 2 of them had a lot of cash, over $200. Having cash was against the rules, and when the kids were asked where they got it, they said it was payment for a hit on John Parker. Now, that stunned Toth, but not nearly as much as what the officer said next. These two kids said the person who had arranged this hit was a former high school classmate of theirs named Daniel Hicks. And Toth couldn't believe what he was hearing because Daniel Hicks was John's own 15-year-old stepson. Toth had really begun to think that this murder could be a professional hit, but it did not occur to him that this hit could be linked to family and also a child. Now, the officer on the phone explained that they really hadn't taken this very seriously at the time, so no one had notified John's family or spoken to Daniel about it. Which, Toth did not have to point out here, but this was a huge screw-up. But he wasn't focused on, the right and wrong of it. He was just focused on figuring out what happened. And so Toth got the names of these two kids with the cash from the officer, and when he hung up, he immediately sent some of his own officers to track these kids down. Then Toth put in a call to Judy. He needed to bring her son, Daniel, in for an interview, and since he was a minor, Judy was going to have to come too. Late that same night, actually after midnight, Toth was once again inside of an interrogation room with Judy. But this time, instead of answering questions herself, Judy was sitting at the back of the room, watching while her son Daniel sat at the table with Toth and a few other detectives. Toth had spoken to Judy right before this, and she had seemed genuinely shocked to hear that her child apparently asked somebody to kill John. She told Toth there had to be a mistake here, and she was happy for police to speak to Daniel directly because that would allow them to clear this all up. Toth had decided not to ask Judy about the affair with Barry at that moment because she was being very cooperative, letting them speak to her son, and he also just didn't want to upset her and have her change her mind. They also had not been able to find those two kids that Daniel supposedly hired, and so right now, Daniel was the only one he could speak to. And so now, watching Daniel, Toth could see he was acting like a typical young person who was in trouble. He seemed nervous, and he was blinking a lot, and he kept rearranging his hands like he wasn't really sure what to do with them. And so Toth decided his best approach was just to be direct. Maybe he could scare the truth out of Daniel. So right off the bat, he told Daniel he knew about the murder for hire, and he told him to explain himself. And to Toth's surprise, Daniel took a big breath and then said it was true. He had actually paid two friends some money he had saved from his allowance because he hated his stepdad. John was always on his case and yelling at him, and Daniel just wanted it to stop. But Daniel said he didn't want John to die. He was adamant that he had just asked his friends to, teach John a lesson and beat him up. Toth thought about this. It was possible that Daniel was telling the truth here, and the two kids in the detention center either lied or had decided on their own to kill John. But that felt a little far-fetched, because why would these kids lie to get themselves in more trouble? Toth thought it was much more likely that Daniel was the one who was lying, and Toth was not about to let Daniel go anywhere until he found out for sure. So he told Daniel and Judy that he was sorry, but they were going to have to take Daniel into custody. Then Toth called some officers in to make the arrest, and as he left the room, you could hear Judy and Daniel sounding completely shocked behind him. Now, at this point, even though Toth had been up all night and he was totally exhausted, at the same time, he actually felt far more alert than he did even in the couple days before, because now it felt like they really were, making movement on this case. And so instead of trying to get some rest back at his house, he went back to his office, poured some coffee, and kept on working. On May 15th, 2003, so almost a month after John Parker's murder, Detective Don Toth sat at his desk reading some copy for a flyer and making some last-minute changes to it. So far, it said that police were looking for information about John Parker's murder in Mrballen, and it offered a reward to anybody who came forward. Toth planned to pass these flyers out all over town tomorrow to see if the public could maybe give him a new lead. It was sort of an act of desperation, because while this case had seemed close a couple times to being wrapped up, just a few weeks ago, now it was pretty much dead. It had taken police a while, but they had finally found both of those kids from the detention center that Daniel apparently hired to, rough up his dad, who ultimately apparently killed him. And the kids admitted to meeting with Daniel and accepting the money. But it turned out there was just no way they were actually the murderers. One of them had been thousands of miles away in Las Vegas when John was killed, and the other had been in detention at a juvenile facility. And so since Toth could not prove the assassins Daniel hired had actually killed anyone, he'd had to let Daniel go. But that didn't mean Daniel was innocent here. Those two kids had said that Daniel did ask for John to be killed, not just beat up. So Daniel was lying about that. And Toth didn't think someone who wanted to kill his father had just stopped wanting to kill his dad all of a sudden. But since Toth knew Daniel was at home babysitting his younger siblings during the time of John's murder, Toth figured he'd likely gotten somebody else to do it. But Toth couldn't just keep talking to Daniel, because Judy had gotten a lawyer, and they were now not letting Toth question the family members at all anymore, which was very frustrating, since Toth wasn't done with Judy either. Out of everyone, she benefited the most from John's death because she was a beneficiary on his life insurance. And she was very likely having an affair with his office manager, Barry, and so maybe part of her motive could have been just to hide the affair from him. And then also Barry. He's potentially having this affair with Judy, John's wife. He might have a motive as well to get rid of John, to just keep this thing a secret. Also, he definitely seemed to think that John was, a pretty tough boss, and so maybe he just had had enough, and he was complicit or actively involved in getting rid of John. He was also at the scene of the crime right when it happened, and since there weren't any cameras, Toth couldn't actually confirm Barry's version of events. But at this point, Toth didn't have the evidence he needed to prove any of these suspects actually killed John or hired somebody to do it. And he also didn't have enough evidence to eliminate them and narrow down his pool further. Instead, Toth had just kept adding to it. Because as of this week, he was also considering John's brother, David, as a person of interest. A few days ago, some officers had been called to Judy's house because John's brother David had stopped by her house and gotten into a verbal fight with the family. And this was not the first time this had happened. Apparently, David had gone over there and threatened the family before. One time, he had even damaged their car. This kind of behavior could mean David was just lashing out because he was grieving, but it also could mean he was erratic and potentially violent. Plus, he had been with John on the afternoon of the murder at that buffet, and he knew that John was going to have dinner with his wife later, so he could have guessed that John would check in at the office after they were done eating, since he was a famously hard worker. Toth sighed and took a break from looking at this flyer. His brain was fried, but he felt hopeful these flyers would give him the tip he desperately needed to break this case. And so the next day, Toth and some other officers passed these flyers out. But then weeks went by with no tips. And even though Toth did eventually get a few responses to the flyers, none of them gave him any actual evidence. So over the next few months, Toth spent his days in his office, poring over files for something he missed, or maybe a witness they didn't interview, or evidence they'd maybe overlooked. But there was just nothing. And as the months turned into years, Toth had to turn to other projects. And eventually, the John Parker murder case went cold. "4 years after John's murder, on an afternoon in February of 2007, Toth arrived at work for the day and headed to his office. Now, he had not forgotten about the John Parker case, but he was not actively investigating it at this point. In fact, all his cases had been winding down because he was planning to retire in just a few months. But right before he actually got to his office door, a narcotics officer caught up to him and asked for a word. The officer explained that he knew Toth wasn't on their narcotics team, but they had a warrant out for a man involved in one of their drug investigations, and they had realized this man had some crossover with one of Toth's homicides from 2003, the John Parker case. Toth stopped in his tracks and immediately told this officer to go get him an interview. And sure enough, later that day, Toth sat down with this man who was very chatty and seemed extremely eager to talk. And the first thing this man did was explain that the person he lived with knew John Parker, and they had admitted to him that they were directly involved in his death. And when this man told Toth the name of this person, Toth couldn't believe it. He leaned back in his chair feeling both relieved and also disturbed. He was relieved because he finally knew who John Parker's killer was, and he was disturbed because this case was now way more twisted than he had ever imagined. Based on the police investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to John Parker on the night of April 17th, 2003. At around 10 p.m., the killer crept slowly through the shadowy parking lot at J&J Parker Industries. They were wearing a mask and dark clothes, and they were carrying a .25 caliber gun. They could see John's car by the office entrance, with Judy sitting inside of it. But she was not the killer's target. John was. And John was also near the car. He was not inside of it. He was standing right outside one of the back car doors. It was open, and he was rifling around, inside the car, looking for something. And as the killer stared at John, thinking about what they were going to do next, they thought about John, who this man was, and how controlling and selfish he was. He had made the killer's life a living hell. And now, the killer was going to get retribution. So, while John continued to have his back turned, the killer silently walked up right behind him. They raised their gun, aimed at the back of his head, and they fired. And it was a direct hit that hit him right behind the ear, and John fell so fast that when the killer fired a second time, they just missed. Now, the killer had never murdered anyone before, so they were shocked by what they had just done. But they were kind of jostled back into reality when they heard John's wife, Judy, yelling out and screaming. And so quick as can be, the killer grabbed John's wallet, so the police would think this was maybe a robbery gone wrong, and then they turned and sprinted off into the night. Much later that night, the killer waited at home until the person who had masterminded this whole thing arrived, and they gave them a hug and said they had done a good job. The mastermind then took the gun, John's wallet, and the clothes the killer wore during the murder, and told the killer they were disposing of them. And the killer just listened, feeling very relieved. He trusted the mastermind more than anybody else in the whole world, because, after all, she was his mother. It would turn out Judy had convinced her own 15-year-old son, Daniel, to murder his stepfather, her husband. Judy wanted to get out of her marriage with John, but she knew if she divorced him, she would have only gotten half of his estate and their business. And so with his death, she could get the whole thing. Now, she had actually already tried to kill John, just unsuccessfully. First, she had tried to poison him, but when that didn't work, she had hired a hitman herself. But that also failed. So finally, she asked Daniel to help by promising that he would get some of the money. And she had also enlisted her daughter, Christina, who was the one who found the gun to kill John with. Daniel actually tried to hire somebody else for the job, but then ultimately just did it himself and used his younger siblings for an alibi, saying he was at home babysitting. And the man who told all this to the police was Christina's husband, who she married 2 years after John's death. And once her husband gave authorities the whole story, police interrogated both Christina and Daniel, who eventually confessed. Judy was convicted of murder and sentenced to 33 years in prison, while Daniel got 23 years in prison. And Christina received 5 years for her part in the murder as well. Christina would die in 2013 from a drug overdose. Daniel was released in 2017, and Judy was released in 2022.